As you know, when a female black widow spider finds a mate, she'll usually kill that mate after she decides that he's no longer useful to her. And sometimes women do the same thing, and they pick up the moniker, the Black Widow Killer. Today I'm going to tell you about North Carolina's Black Widow Killer, Blanche Taylor Moore. Welcome to the NC Everything Podcast. I'm your host, Curtis, and this is the bi-weekly show where I talk about everything that has anything to do with North Carolina. Thank you all for being here, and I hadn't said this in a while, but this is episode 106. I'm 99% sure this is episode 106. I usually don't, I used to call off all the episode numbers, and I hadn't done that in a while. I don't check in much, but yeah, episode 106. I won't do a whole lot of talking before I get started today. I did, when I edited the last episode, I noticed, I had mentioned the sweat bees flying all around. Two things. One, when I did the editing, I noticed the sweat bees were literally crawling on the camera lens. A couple times you can see them if you're watching on YouTube. And also, I had gone to a funeral around that time, and I was complaining about the sweat bees, and my uncle told me that it comes from corn, and we are surrounded by cornfields around here, and I've seen sweat bees my whole life. I never knew that it was the cornfields that really drew them in. So, I'm 40 years old. I'll be 42 in a few months. And 42 years, I never knew about the corn sweat bee connection. So that was really interesting. Let's see. Also, I'm recording this about 5 days before it comes out. So if you watch this on Saturday, the first Saturday in August, I'm right there with you, but I'm going to try to record 3 or 4 today. So, hopefully I'll get that done and I'll get a nice head start on you. All right, moving on. If you like the episode, don't forget to rate, review, subscribe. I usually don't like saying that. I say it at the beginning of every episode. I'm actually not a fan of saying that at the beginning because you haven't even got to the content yet. But if I don't say it at the beginning, I'm liable to forget by the end of it. So, rate, review, subscribe, and you can check out the links below. There's a contact, or my email address is there in case you want to suggest an episode. There's a link to the Facebook group. And if you're listening and you'd rather watch, there's a link to the YouTube channel. And if you're watching and you'd rather just listen, you can find me on most podcast players. And I know I say that in every episode. I think I say it a little different in every episode. If you're watching, I have my laptop here, but I usually don't have a set format for telling you to rate, review, subscribe, check the links out. Facebook, YouTube, podcast player. I just kind of wing it every time I go. But I have a lot of faithful listeners, and they've heard me say it a million times. They know what to do, and even if you're not a faithful listener, you've watched enough, most of you have watched enough YouTube and listened to enough podcasts by now. You know that if you like an episode of something, you typically subscribe or give it the thumbs up or what have you. All right, before I get started, I will say I've been typing up a script for probably the past 10 or 12 episodes. I don't necessarily stick to the script, but it's a huge guideline for me. But I wanted to go back to my old style, which is just a few basic notes, at least for this episode. So I don't have full sentences here on my laptop. It's just notes and highlighted in red and all, just so I try to remember what to talk about. So this episode could sound a lot like my older episodes where I give you a whole lot of uhs and have to think for a second on what I'm going to try to say. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get into it. We're going to be talking about Blanche Taylor Moore. And I may call her Taylor Blanche Moore. I realized a few times in my notes that I had it switched around, but her actual name is Blanche Taylor Moore. And this episode was suggested by Christian, who's a friend from work. So thank you, Christian, for bringing that up. I actually didn't know a whole lot about her, and it was really interesting research. And so, as always, I'm going to start with the origin story or the backstory. And there's been a few cases where there wasn't a whole lot to say, and this is one of them. Blanche Kaiser was born in Concord, North Carolina. Her mama was Flonnie Blanche, and her dad was Parker Davis Kaiser. And her dad may have had a huge part of who she ended up being. he was a Baptist minister, and there's nothing wrong with that, but he was a Baptist minister, but apparently he was also a womanizer, and he kind of tended to be abusive in multiple ways toward women. And on top of all that, he was an alcoholic, and it said that he had gambling debts, and that Blanche Taylor Moore would later say that he forced her into prostitution to kind of pay for his debts. And the thing is, she was, ultimately on trial for murder. I think that's a really bad time to trust anything anybody says if they're literally fighting for their life. So in that situation, there's no telling what's actually true. Well, then in 1966, her dad supposedly died of a heart attack. So hold on to that. Her father's heart attack will come back later on. Now, that was 1966, but let's back up a little bit. In May of 1952, Blanche Taylor Moore marries James Napoleon Taylor. The two would end up having 2 children together, one in 1953 and one in 1959. In 1954, Blanche gets a job as a cashier at Kroger in Burlington, North Carolina. And she must not have made a very good impression with her coworkers because they called her two-faced and said she kind of lied and cheated and, kind of vindictive. So I guess she wasn't well liked by her coworkers, but she did end up moving up to head cashier by 1959. And head cashier, I was reading in my research, head cashier is kind of like customer service now, but what's more important is back then, the head cashier was the highest job a female could get in a grocery store. A few years later, in 1962, she started having an affair with a store manager named Raymond Reed. Now, I'm not sure if he was her store manager. He was certainly a manager of Kroger's, but later it talks about how he moved to different stores. But he was a recently divorced store manager. She started seeing him despite her still being married to James. However, 11 years after she started seeing Raymond, James Taylor died. This was October 2nd, 1973. And very similar to her father, who died of a heart attack in 1966, her husband, James Taylor, also died of a heart attack, or supposedly so. But lo and behold, husband James is dead, so now Taylor and Reed start seeing each other in the open, or it says dating publicly. So they got nothing to hide now, so they can, start going out in daylight, I guess you could say. And everything in that relationship seemed to be going pretty well. Or I guess it depends on who you talk to. Reed said that the relationship was going really well. He even commented to some of his friends that he thought about asking Blanche Taylor Moore to marry him. But by 1985, things were going downhill. Like I said, Reed, he would work different stores between Alamance County and Forsyth County. He was a manager, so he was jumping around in different stores, but Blanche Taylor Moore, she only worked at the one store. And I don't know if she got jealous or lonely, but everything seems like it was around this time, around 1985, that she started dating Robert J. Hutton. He was a regional manager. He was the regional manager for Kroger for the Piedmont Triad area. And even though she was kind of messing around with Hutton, she was still dating Reed, but the Hutton relationship didn't last very long at all. I don't know if he saw through her shit or what, but it ended pretty quick, and she filed a sexual harassment lawsuit against Hutton and Kroger in October of that same year, 1985. And also in October, on October 17th, to be specific, she would leave Kroger. She would end her employment there, which was probably a good idea since she was, suing the regional manager and the store. And I couldn't find anything that says Kroger fired her. I think she left on her own. But Hutton was forced to resign himself, and Kroger supposedly settled the case out of court 2 years later for $275,000 in 1985 money. And then on Easter Sunday of that same year, she meets the Reverend Dwight Moore. He was a divorced pastor of the Carolina United Church of Christ in Alamance County. And it started out as just friends. She met him, they got acquainted, they liked each other, but then she started kind of meeting at his house, or they started meeting every once in a while, for supper at his house. And I think even then, both of them wanted to progress the relationship into something more. But it says that she had that lawsuit against Kroger going on. And the fact, we know now she was kind of going through men pretty quick. She wanted to kind of keep her feelings toward the Reverend pretty quiet because she didn't want the court to accuse her of using and abusing men, kind of going through them. What they call it, the flavor of the month. She was trying to make it look like in the court that the thing with Hutton was a real serious relationship that went bad. She didn't want to look like she was using people. I guess I said way too many words to explain that. And one other thing to remember, even though she had that thing with Hutton and now she's kind of talking to the Reverend, she's still messing around with Raymond Reed. And it would ultimately be her relationship with the Reverend Moore that would come to her downfall. At some point during that relationship, she asked the Reverend if he could get her some arsenic-based ant killer. And I don't know if he ever got her the ant killer, but everything I read, it was kind of innocuous. You can buy ant killer, or you can still buy ant killer at Lowe's or Home Depot. Just asking to go pick me up some ant killer wasn't that, that riveting. Anyway, a couple months after she quit Kroger, what I was talking about, she met Raymond Reed on New Year's Eve, and she made him some of her special homemade potato soup. Then on January 1st, 1986, just a few days later, or the next day, he started getting real sick and nauseous and vomiting, had diarrhea. So less than 24 hours after eating Blanche's famous soup, it was coming out both ends, is what they say. And over the next few months, he ended up missing 4 or 5 weeks of work, which he never missed work at as a manager with Kroger. But over the next few months, he missed a bunch of work, and he ended up losing his job on May 29th, 1986. Well, eventually, his condition worsened, and so he finally went to Wesley Long Hospital in Greensboro, and he was initially diagnosed with shingles. And I've had shingles once, and vomiting and diarrhea wasn't part of it. So I'm not sure how that came to be. And maybe I don't know everything about, certainly I don't know everything about shingles, but my shingles didn't cause me to vomit and get that sick. But by June 5th, Raymond Reed started getting better, and his doctor told him in front of Blanche that he will probably be able to go home in a week. And lo and behold, he didn't get better. He got a whole lot worse. And when he was transferred to North Carolina Baptist Hospital in Winston-Salem on June 13th. At Baptist Hospital, that's where Dr. Robert Hamilton diagnosed him with Guillain-Barré syndrome, which I don't know a whole lot about, but they also run some blood tests there and took a urine sample. Now, what they wouldn't find out till a long time after was that blood and urine sample, or the blood sample, it showed elevated levels of arsenic in his blood. The problem is it was never passed along back to Dr. Hamilton or anybody because of this staffing change that took place, just bad timing. So those blood sample results that would have showed he had arsenic in his blood kind of got lost in the mix. However, despite him being deathly ill and us knowing now he had arsenic in his blood, he did start recovering. And around this time, Blanche, she asked if she could start bringing Raymond Reed some food in the hospital. And she, keep in mind, she asked permission to do this, and she got permission. That comes back later when she tries to defend herself. So Blanche would start bringing her famous soup in. There's evidence or testimony that she was feeding Raymond Reed some banana pudding at some point. And guess what? He got really, really sick and started going down again. One of his nurses later testified that Raymond was pleading with her and said, "Please help me, I'm going to die." Despite that, Blanche kept bringing frozen yogurt, milkshakes, iced tea, and again, her famous soup. And despite his ups and downs, mostly downs, I will say the doctors did everything they knew to do to try to save his life. Unfortunately, he died at Baptist Hospital in Winston-Salem on October 7th, 1986. He was 50 years old, and at that time, they did label the cause of his death that Guillain-Barré syndrome. And I read that they wanted to do an autopsy, but almost immediately as soon as he died, Blanche told the doctors that they couldn't do an autopsy. He's already been through too much, and he wouldn't want to be cut open like this, so we can't do the autopsy. And so they didn't. Now, like I said, when when Blanche's first husband, James, died, she started openly seeing Reed. Well, now that Reed was gone, she started openly seeing the Reverend Moore. And the relationship with Reverend Moore got serious real quick after they were able to do it in public because they planned to get married. And I mean, this wasn't just the Reverend talking to his friends. Him and Blanche had serious plans to get married, but she was diagnosed with breast cancer in 1987, so it kind of got pushed back or canceled. Initially, it was pushed back. You know, they were going to plan to get married maybe in November. But the Reverend Moore started getting kind of sick around that time. It started as just, upset stomach and diarrhea. When he finally went to the hospital, they said he had some kind of intestinal ailment, and he ended up getting 2 surgeries to try to correct this. Ultimately, Blanche and the Reverend did get married 2 years later in April of 1989. They would have their honeymoon in New Jersey, and then a few days after they came back, Reverend Moore started getting really sick, and he collapsed to the floor after eating a chicken sandwich that Blanche had given him. Now, it was a fast food chicken sandwich. It didn't say which restaurant it came from, but I didn't want you to think, it was food poisoning. Blanche went and got this sandwich from whatever restaurant it was, and she's the one that handed it to him. And I'm not trying to be coy. It's a Black Widow story. We all know where this is going. Well, Reverend Moore, he spent 4 or 5 days just vomiting and diarrhea. I mean, if that don't sound familiar. Eventually, on April 28th, he was admitted to Alamance County Hospital. And just like with Raymond Reed, they couldn't really figure out what was going on with him. So he bounced between Alamance County Hospital to the Baptist Hospital in Winston-Salem. Eventually, he was relocated to North Carolina Memorial Hospital in Chapel Hill. And by the way, I was born at that hospital. And when I was born there, it was called North Carolina Memorial Hospital. Now it's just UNC Hospital, Chapel Hill. And really, I was born there. My wife was born there. My kids were born there. I think my mom and dad were born there. I'm in Orange County. It's in Orange County. Now, despite him bouncing between the 3 hospitals, when he got to UNC, it was looking like he was on his deathbed. He was about to die. And he had told the doctors that he was working with some herbicide poison. And so they ordered a tox screen or toxicology screen. And when it came back, it showed that the Reverend Moore had 20 times the lethal dose of arsenic in his system. So 20 times the lethal dose. It said this was the most arsenic found in a living person in the hospital's history. However, even though he had 20 times the lethal dose, the Reverend Moore actually didn't die. Blanche Taylor Moore, she didn't kill this one. She gave it her best shot, I will say that, but somehow or another, he survived. And even though he survived, he didn't make a full recovery. Apparently, he still has trouble with his hands and his feet. He kind of has tremors and shakes. It messed him up for sure, but he did survive it. But going back to them finding the lethal dose of 20 times the lethal dose, this is the beginning of the end, because the FBI comes in after it came out that he had arsenic in his system, and they interviewed Moore. And this is where Moore tells them that his wife's previous boyfriend also died. Well, he died of the Guillain-Barré syndrome. And the FBI knew that the symptoms for that syndrome, they're very similar to the symptoms you would find in somebody who's been poisoned by arsenic. And so now they're investigating Blanche. And one of the first things they find out is that Blanche tried to change the Reverend Moore's pension to make herself the beneficiary. So now red flags are going off everywhere. But it just keeps getting worse for Blanche, because now with the arsenic poison and them knowing that she tried to change the pension, they decide to exhume her first husband, James Taylor, her boyfriend, Raymond Reed, and her father, Parker Kaiser. And no surprise, all 3 bodies had elevated levels of arsenic in their system. And not to kick a dead horse, I said that the Reverend, he had 20 times the lethal dose in his system. Well, James Taylor, he had 30 times the normal, or not normal, 30 times the lethal dose in his system. And her father had 60 times the lethal dose in his system. And so I guess it's good for the Reverend. Her poisons are Good for the Reverend. Her poisons were going down over the years. Maybe that's why he survived, but she poisoned the shit out of her daddy. On July 18th, 1989, Blanche Taylor Moore was arrested and charged with first-degree murder in the deaths of Reed and Taylor. As far as the Reverend Moore goes, she was charged with assault with a deadly weapon. And I've done a few crime shows on this podcast, and I'm going to do some more. I already have another one lined up for a few episodes from now. But it always seems like criminals, when they think they're going to get caught, they do dumb stuff. And after they've been caught, they say dumb stuff. I say that because even though they exhumed the bodies and found all this arsenic in their system, some of the initial interviews with Blanche Taylor Moore, she suggested that Reed and her husband James were depressed and they probably poisoned themselves with arsenic. I don't know. I didn't actually look this up. I don't know if anybody's ever committed suicide by arsenic. But anyway, I laughed when I read it because, it's like he shot himself in the back twice. That, it just doesn't make any sense. And continuing with the criminals say dumb stuff, she went to court in Forsyth County on October 21st, 1990. And there she denied ever bringing any hospital or bringing any food to Reed. She denied bringing him food, even though she specifically asked permission from a hospital official to do so. And there were dozens of hospital officials, nurses, doctors, who testified that they saw her feeding him food that she brought from home. Yet she goes in there, and not only does she say, I didn't bring him food, she says that she didn't even see him the whole time he was in the hospital. Hundreds of people saw her seeing him in the hospital. It's kind of dumb. Anyway, despite all the dumb stuff she would say, she was ultimately convicted on November 14th, 1990. On November 17th, the jury recommended the death penalty. And I'm sorry if I look irritated, and this is going to happen in my next crime episode coming up, and it's worse than this. But it's not the next episode, but it's coming up in a few episodes. I have a big problem, and I'm not going to make this a political podcast, but I have a big problem with our justice system and how we do things now. I have a big problem with the word criminal rights. Again, I'm not going on a bandstand here, but you'll notice when I do these crime episodes, especially when it comes down to trial and sentencing, I usually get a little edgy because, criminals tend to get forgiveness and paroled and get to go back to their life. But if you murder somebody, they don't get to go back to their life. You can't undo a murder. You can't undo molestation. You can't undo rape. But those people can be forgiven. And it doesn't sit right with me. Anyway, I'm going back to the story now. So she was sentenced to die. And like everybody always does, she appealed it. On January 18th, 1991, a judge concurred that she should die by lethal injection. And her lawyers, they tried to appeal. They said she didn't get a fair trial because they shouldn't have brought up her father's death or her former lover's death in this trial with Raymond Reed or with Moore. They did everything they could. And then there was this weird confession letter. It was a deathbed confession written by a homeless man who at that time had since written the letter, passed away. His name was Garvin Thomas. And the letter went on to say that he was infatuated with Moore and that he killed her lovers so he could be close to her. And a handwriting expert fairly quickly determined that Blanche Taylor Moore wrote that letter herself. Now, Blanche Taylor Moore was never executed. Again, with the justice system issues, she has been sitting on death row since 1990. Today, she's at the North Carolina Correctional Institution for Women, and she's known as prisoner number 0288088. Now, because of what they call automatic appeals, I'm not exactly sure how automatic appeals work, but because of automatic appeals, that's why she's still living up there at the women's prison. She's been on death row for over 31 years, and this year, she's 90 years old, and this makes her the oldest woman on death row in the United States. And it's July 30th, 2023, At the time I put these notes together, Blanche Taylor Moore was still alive and is the oldest woman on death row in the United States. For all I know, she died this morning before I turned the camera on. And I'll finish this episode up by running down the pop culture of Blanche Taylor Moore. In 1993, Jim Shoots wrote a book called Preacher's Girl, The Life and Crimes of Blanche Taylor Moore. Also in 1993, Elizabeth Montgomery, she played Blanche Taylor Moore in the TV movie Black Widow Murders, the Blanche Taylor Moore story. In 1999, Discovery Channel, they had a show called The New Detectives, and in season 4, episode 6, Women Who Kill, they featured Blanche Taylor Moore. And it said they covered Blanche Taylor Moore in the shows Evil Lives Here and Snapped. And in season 1 of Deadly Women, she was portrayed by Maha Mesh. I don't know that lady's name. You can check out season 1 of Deadly Women, and there's a segment about Blanche Taylor Moore in there. And I'm sure, because I used to, before I started podcasting on my own, I used to listen to a bunch of podcasts. I'm sure there's a ton of podcasts out there on Blanche Taylor Moore. I got an ant crawling on me. If you're watching on YouTube, I'm swinging my arm all around. I can feel that little sucker on me. I couldn't see him. Anyway, I'm sure there's a ton of podcasts out there. Probably a few YouTube videos on Blanche Taylor Moore. But that's the end of episode 106 on Blanche Taylor Moore, or criminal or prisoner number. I lost it in my notes, but I'm going to probably name this episode whatever her prison number was. Anyway, if you like the show, don't forget to rate, review, subscribe. Christian from work, I hope you liked the episode since it was your suggestion, and maybe next week or next few weeks I'll ask you what you thought about it. It's not usual that I actually get to go and talk to the people who suggest episodes, but with the exception of Christian and my sister Kristen, I don't. Otherwise, outside of those two people, I don't usually get to talk to my listener suggesters. Anyway, don't forget to check out the links below so you can watch if you're listening and listen if you're watching. And you can go to the Facebook group for even more NC Everything content, or even more NC Everything. And going back to suggestions just for a minute, I do have several listener suggestions in line. If you do have a suggestion for an episode, I will. If I can put together an episode for it, I certainly will. Some of my suggestions I hadn't been able to ever put together an episode. I'm kind of leaving them in the bank in case I can put them in another episode later. But if you do suggest something, it could be a bit of a wait before I get to it. But I do love the suggestions, so don't hesitate to reach out and let me know what you're thinking. And with that being said, I'll talk to you in a couple weeks.